Hi everyone, it's Wednesday, which means it is time for Killer Wednesday. I haven't been here for a few weeks. I've been busy and I was pet sitting, but I am back, and this week we are going to talk about child killer Peter Woodcock. So, Peter Woodcock was born in Peterborough, Ontario in 1939. And his mum was, I believe she was a teen mum. She was a factory worker, and unfortunately she did have a bit of difficulty raising Peter. He was quite a difficult baby. He wouldn't eat, he would cry consistently, and anything she did it just wouldn't help. At just a month old, she did give Peter up for adoption, and during this time as a baby, he did continue to cry and screech whenever he was approached by people. It's unknown why he did this, but it is possible there was some sort of abuse that went on. He bounced around temporary foster homes, and this was essentially to prevent him gaining any long-term attachments. Because foster homes aren't obviously like a permanent thing. And I don't know why they didn't keep him in like a care facility. But I guess maybe just so he could have some sort of family. But again, because he didn't get attached, he didn't have that emotional connection with anyone. By the time he was 1, Peter was absolutely terrified of people, and again, I don't blame him because he was bounced around so many foster homes that, again, he didn't have time to get properly attached to people. His speech was often described as just him making animal noises. He did suffer abuse in his early childhood at the hands of these temporary foster parents, and that could explain why he was so terrified of people. He did have to go to hospital for a neck injury at 2 years old after a beating at one of his foster families, and he was then eventually placed with Frank and Susan Maynard, and they became very attached to Peter. At 5, he eventually stopped crying when he was approached by strangers, but he was still described as quite a strange child. He just did not get along with his peers. And again, this could be because of the early childhood abuse. It could be because he didn't form those early attachments, he was maybe unsure how to connect with people. His size and strangeness made him a very easy target for bullies, and he would be found hiding from these bullies. He was once found cowering behind some bushes, hiding from his bullies, and he said that he wanted to be where God could see him. Peter's foster parents did originally worry about this behaviour, and they sent him to a hospital for mentally ill children. The doctors did their best with what they had at the time, but unfortunately at this point the brain and psychology department, they weren't that well established because again it was like the 1940s. At 11 he was at the Canadian National Exhibition Centre, and he was overheard saying to a social worker, quote, "I wish a bomb would drop on the exhibition and kill all the children," end quote. He was then sent to a school for emotionally disturbed children. However, this did nothing to dull what was said that he had violent sexual urges at the time. At 13, he stated that he had consensual sex with a 12-year-old girl, but at that time, when you're 12, 13 years old, even if you give consent, it's still counted as a rape. But again, because they were both under the age of 16, it probably wasn't taken very seriously. By 16, Peter was then back with his foster parents, and it was said that this was when his actions turned dark. Peter's prized possession was his bicycle. He loved it, and he would go on his bike, it was said, to escape his bullies. He would imagine he was the leader of a gang of kids and not the social outcast that he actually was. And it's very sad because he obviously didn't connect with anyone his age, and so this is how he coped with that loneliness. He was also fascinated with the human body, and he had books at home that he would study, feeding into his own sexual desires. He would lure children with the promise of a bike ride, and once he got them alone, things then turned dark. He would choke them into unconsciousness and undress them, and sometimes he would just look at the naked bodies, but then this turned into a sexual assault. Moving on to his crimes, in 1956, Peter lured a 7-year-old Wayne Maletti away from the exhibition grounds. He strangled him to death, and when leaving the scene, he actually told a guard that someone similar to how he looked had fled the scene of this murder. Wayne's body was found the next day, and it looked as if he had been undressed and then redressed. He had bite marks all over his body, and his attacker had actually scattered pennies around the body, I guess kind of like a sort of marker, and the person who had killed him had defecated nearby. Police initially arrested Ron Moffat, even though he did have an alibi, and after a grueling interrogation, unfortunately the 14-year-old was arrested because he was led into this false confession, which is actually quite a common tactic in America, especially if the person is underage and they're not with an adult. What will happen is the police will interrogate them for hours and hours until the person just becomes so exhausted, and the police will say, look, if you just confess, this can be over, and it leads to a bunch of false confessions. He wasn't released until the next year, unfortunately, but that's because they did catch Peter. In October of 1956, Peter lured 9-year-old Gary Morris from his home, and he led the child to a beach called Cherry Beach. He strangled the boy, and Gary later died, unfortunately, of a ruptured liver. His body looked like the last body that was found. It looked like it had been redressed by the killer. Peter also actually sprinkled sand around the body, and again, it was like a calling card, I guess. On January 19th, 1957, Peter then lured Carol Voice away from her home, and sorry, I totally can't read my own writing. But anyway, he led her away, he sexually molested her, and choked her into unconsciousness, and it was actually discovered that she had died after being sexually assaulted by a tree branch. Peter was then seen leaving the scene, and once again spoke to someone nearby, saying, quote, if they find a body back there, they are going to think it was me, end quote. And that's just like a really odd thing to say. January 21st, 1957, Peter was actually arrested, and he was afraid that his mum would get to him when she learned of his crimes. I don't know if this was because he thought she would hit him or punish him in some way, but he was adamant, like, don't let my mum get to me. He confessed to all the murders after learning that his mum wouldn't get to him. During the trial for his murder of Carol Voice, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, which nowadays is very difficult to prove. He was sent to a maximum security mental health centre in Ontario, and he was officially diagnosed as a psychopath. Peter was a guinea pig, unfortunately, for many treatments that led to a progress in psychology. This was mostly LSD, which he did like, but it didn't really do anything for his psychopathy. Peter was known to manipulate fellow inmates for trading cigarettes in order to get oral sex. So he was a very psychosexual killer. That is what he is known as. He was eventually transferred to a lower level secure facility, I imagine because of good behaviour, and he was then allowed a supervised trip to a museum. He was able to see The Silence of the Lambs in cinemas, and he actually liked Hannibal Lecter and thought he was actually mistreated in the movie. But this is because I feel that he probably related to Hannibal Lecter a lot. Peter then legally changed his name to David Michael Kruger. He became friends with a former patient and security guard, Bruce Hamill. Peter at this point convinced Bruce that forming like a brotherhood would solve their issues, especially if they killed another inmate, Dennis Kerr. In July 1991, Bruce went to a hardware store and bought a hammer and some knives, and he sent Peter out of the institution at this point. And within the first hour, Peter and Bruce met Dennis under the pretense of like some sort of loan. The two ambushed him, killing him and mutilating his body, and after killing Dennis, they then sexually assaulted the body. Peter actually left Bruce at the scene and turned himself in, and he was sent back to a maximum security facility. On March 5th, 2010, he died of natural causes. So it seems that he could never really be cured, so to speak, of his desires, and when he was put to a lower level facility, he was able to manipulate people into taking him out for the day so he could actually commit more of these crimes. Maybe if he was treated better as a child, he might not have been treated this way. There's nothing to say that he had any sort of brain damage or his brain was damaged in the womb or anything like that, but obviously he did have and was diagnosed with psychopathy. But let me know what you think, and if you have any cases you would like me to look into, leave a comment below, and I will be here on